Recovered survey plates from the northeastern marches of Ultima Segmentum show worlds that should not have been empty. Orbital Pict captures record dry oceans, blackened transitways, and abandoned settlements laid out with the practical geometry of Imperial colonization, but with no visible pattern of orderly evacuation. There are no relief convoys in the skies, no military cordons, no salvage operations, and no functioning beacons beyond intermittent distress ghosts. In fragmentary reports preserved by later investigators, the earliest observers did not describe a clean military incursion. They described disappearance, contamination, and an expanding condition that behaved like a campaign and an affliction at the same time. Some outposts spoke of machinery where no industry had existed. Others reported mass decline among planetary populations without a conventional pathogen, siege line, or atmospheric event sufficient to explain the scale. The event would later be remembered in the few surviving references not erased or sealed as the Pale Wasting. The region in which these reports emerged was already feared long before the crisis received a name. The Ghoul Stars sat at the far northeastern edge of the known galaxy, a desolate and poorly understood reach of void space lit by failing suns and marked by scattered dead worlds, incomplete charts, and a long pattern of vanished expeditions. Imperial authority in those depths was always thin. Human settlement had existed there, but never with the security found in better defended sectors. What survived of Imperial knowledge suggested that the deeper zones of the region had a habit of swallowing certainty itself. Explorators, crusaders, and officials could define the frontier on a map, but they could not impose stable understanding upon it. That mattered, because when the first signs of the Pale Wasting emerged, they emerged from a place already associated with incomplete returns, distorted testimony, and things so alien they were often described in terms that sounded supernatural rather than material. The broader political setting made the situation worse. The Pale Wasting unfolded during the era later known as the Nova Terra Interregnum, a period of fracture, mistrust, and weakened central cohesion within the Imperium. Administrative delay was common, jurisdiction overlapped. Astropathic certainty was never absolute even in stable centuries, and in a divided age it became easier for warnings to arrive late, arrive altered, or fail to arrive at all. A frontier calamity beginning in a region as hostile and remote as the Ghoul Stars was therefore positioned to spread before the Imperium could even decide what category of threat it was facing. That uncertainty is central to the event. The surviving descriptions do not present a clean enemy profile. Instead, they preserve a contradiction that never fully resolves. The Pale Wasting is described, on one hand, as a star-spawned plague that swept across human-settled worlds. On the other, it appears in records as nightmare engines slaughtering whole sectors. The two descriptions sound incompatible only if one expects a normal war. The fragments suggest something more complex, where affliction and assault may have been linked phases of the same disaster. The earlier stage appears to have resembled a frontier emergency rather than an acknowledged crusade. A handful of settlements reportedly ceased regular communication. At first, this would not have been extraordinary. Remote colonies frequently suffered generator failure, astropathic disruption, pirate attack, food system collapse, or local insurrection. What drew attention was repetition. Similar failures began appearing across multiple worlds and transit routes. Reports that did arrive shared unusual features. Population decline was often described in passive terms, as though observers were struggling to identify a hostile actor. Civic centres emptied. Habitation zones remained physically standing while their inhabitants were dead, missing, or no longer behaving as populations should. In some accounts, the event moved faster than quarantine doctrine predicted. In others, there was evidence of large moving constructs or engines accompanying the devastation, suggesting that whatever spread across those systems was not merely disease in the biological sense. The language used by later chroniclers was maddeningly vague, but the pattern implies that the Imperium first encountered not a recognizable army, but symptoms. Because the frontier had limited defensive density, the first meaningful response likely fell upon local garrisons, void patrol crews, and whatever authorities could still interpret the situation as something other than coincidental collapse. Governors would have sealed ports. Arbet's precincts would have imposed movement controls. Administratum adepts would have begun loss tabulation. Medical officers would have searched for contamination vectors. None of those actions seem to have been adequate. The phrase star-spawned plague is important not simply because it evokes horror, but because it implies a threat that crossed worlds through interstellar means, while retaining the social and biological effect of pestilence. A planetary governor can lock down districts. A sector command can deploy fleets against invasion. Both become less effective when the mechanism of spread is unclear, and when the same disaster appears simultaneously as corruption, depopulation, and mechanized assault. The surviving record also suggests that the afflicted territory was not confined to a single world, or even a single subsector. References to worlds and sectors indicate a campaign zone broad enough to force the Imperium into escalation. That in itself tells a story. Frontier disasters were common in the long history of the Imperium, but not all of them demanded the mobilization of multiple chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. The Pale Wasting did. 11 chapters were lost in the effort to destroy the threat, while the Novamarines are the only specifically named chapter to remain publicly associated with the conflict. That number changes the scale of the event completely. 11 chapters do not vanish in response to a localized rebellion or a manageable xenos infestation. Their destruction implies a war of extreme duration, severity, or abnormality, and likely all three at once. Before that commitment was made, however, the crisis had to become legible enough to justify it. One can reconstruct the opening progression with some confidence. Human worlds on the fringe begin failing. Distress signals accumulate. Reconnaissance returns with incompatible testimony. Some describe plague conditions, perhaps mass wasting, altered tissue, systemic decline, or total population collapse without conventional battlefield traces. Others describe engines, structures, or machines associated with the advance of the phenomenon. These reports are then evaluated by authorities already working under the distortion of distance and political fragmentation. The result is delay, followed by sudden overcorrection once the true scale becomes undeniable. This would be entirely consistent with Imperial frontier practice. Small losses are tolerated, patterns are doubted. Then an event crosses an invisible threshold, and the response becomes absolute. The Ghoul Stars themselves contributed to this confusion in practical ways. Their reputation as a graveyard frontier was not literary exaggeration. They were known for dead worlds, hostile xenos, and an enduring inability of the Imperium to secure the deeper reaches. Light there was dimmer, colder, and less dependable, both literally and administratively. Dying suns affect not just atmosphere and agriculture on marginal worlds, but the psychology of every observer trying to make sense of unfamiliar phenomena under weak illumination, failing infrastructure, and chronic isolation. Settlements in such zones run lean, supplies are tight, reinforcement windows are wide, communities become accustomed to partial neglect. When something truly catastrophic begins, its first stages can hide inside the normal misery of frontier life. A governor reporting population sickness from a hive world near the galactic core might trigger immediate intervention. The same report from a hard-pressed colony in the Ghoul Stars might be one more file in a stack until the entire planet goes quiet. The name of the event suggests how it was perceived by those who encountered its effects. Wasting is not a term of conquest in the usual sense. It implies depletion, reduction, withering, and progressive loss. Attached to that is the word pale, which in context can be read several ways. It may refer to the condition of the dead or afflicted, to the drained appearance of entire worlds under failing suns, or to something about the invader itself, if invader is even the correct word. The term feels observational rather than doctrinal. That matters because it hints that the first witnesses were not describing a known enemy type. They were naming what they saw happen to places and bodies. Only later do the surviving fragments introduce the nightmare engines, which feel more like an attempt to describe a visible mechanism after the devastation had already begun. The contradiction between plague and engine can be approached without forcing it into certainty. The affliction may have been biological, with machine systems carrying, amplifying, harvesting, or weaponizing it. It may have been xenotech producing environmental collapse on a scale perceived as disease by human populations. It may have involved entities whose methods blurred the boundary between contagion and device. The law does not settle the question, and Chapter 1 should not pretend otherwise. What can be said is that the opening of the Pale Wasting was not experienced by the Imperium as a straightforward invasion marked by banners, fleets, and formal declarations. It entered history as an event of symptoms, contradictory reconnaissance, and spreading absence. One of the most haunting surviving details is that the better-known public memory of the war does not come from a full campaign archive, but from fragments and a stela on terror praising the sacrifice and valour of the Novamarines. That means the war's opening phase was not merely bloody. It was later subjected to deliberate suppression. Records were censored or destroyed by inquisitorial action, and even the Novamarines' own chronicles are notably empty regarding the conflict despite the chapter's honour in it. This silence shapes how the beginning must be narrated. In most Imperial wars, the opening can be reconstructed through orders of battle, fleet movements, casualty estimates, and named commanders. Here the absence of that material is part of the event itself. The first chapter of the Pale Wasting is therefore not only a military opening, it is the beginning of a historical blackout. The opening investigative response likely included all the usual Imperial layers. Administratum clerks would have attempted census comparison against tithe schedules and supply requests. Astropaths would have traced the pattern of lost worlds through message failure and delayed distress bursts. Explorator elements may have been tasked with identifying whether the phenomenon was environmental, technological, or xenogenic. Fleet patrols would have tested void lanes for interception. Astartes commanders, once involved, would have demanded actionable intelligence and received almost none. This is one reason the early phase was probably so lethal. The Imperium was not simply underinformed, it was fighting a threat that denied classification while expanding through a region where classification already lagged behind reality. Reports of worlds being swept away suggest speed, but not necessarily speed in the narrow tactical sense. Swept away can mean that once the condition manifested, societies collapsed faster than they could defend themselves. A world does not need to explode to be effectively removed from Imperial space. Disable its food logistics, corrupt its labour force, sever its command hierarchy, poison its hab blocks with fear and unknown death, and it is gone in any strategic sense long before the last body falls. If nightmare engines then followed or accompanied the spreading condition, they may have functioned as instruments of harvesting, eradication, or the enforcement of whatever process the Pale Wasting represented. Again, the record is fragmentary, but the dual description implies sequence or partnership, not random embellishment. The human experience of the opening stage deserves attention because this event was not first felt by Space Marines. It was felt by colonists, labourers, governors, voidsmen, priests, Medicae teams, and frightened security forces on worlds already living at the edge of Imperial concern. Frontier populations vary, but the typical settlement in such a region would include Voidport personnel, Hab district workers, tithe overseers, technical crews, militia officers, and a ruling structure thinly tied to distant command. Those people would have encountered the Pale Wasting as rumour before certainty. One moon goes silent. A grain convoy arrives with a dead crew. A Medicae station reports unexplained degeneration. A mining colony requests evacuation without providing usable evidence. Vox operators begin hearing the same phrases repeated from unrelated systems. Trade routes contract, ecclesiarchy shrines fill. Then the first visible machines, if machines they were, appear in eyewitness testimony, and fear becomes institutional. That transition from rumour to institutional fear is where the event truly begins. Once local authorities stop asking whether the reports are real and start asking whether anything in the sector can survive them, the Pale Wasting ceases to be a border anomaly and becomes an Imperial emergency. The surviving lore describes the later battle as apocalyptic, which means the beginning was severe enough to set that scale in motion. There is no sign that the Imperium stumbled into a limited corrective action that later expanded by accident. The opposite seems more likely. By the time the broader response formed, the front was already failing. The final point for this opening is that the cause of the event remains officially unresolved. The pale wasting arose from the Ghoul Stars during the later 34th millennium in an age of Imperial fracture, and presented itself through incompatible but persistent signs, a star-spawned plague and nightmare engines. It consumed human worlds on a frightening scale. It forced a response large enough to cost 11 Adeptus Astartes Chapters. It left the Novamarines publicly honoured, yet strangely silent. It triggered a legacy of watchfulness over the Ghoul Stars so serious that later, chapters would be stationed to ensure such a threat did not emerge again. Cause, therefore, can only be stated in the most disciplined terms. The pale wasting began as a frontier manifestation of an ancient and unidentified threat from the Ghoul Stars, one that spread across Imperial worlds by means never clearly preserved, and one that the Imperium chose not merely to fight, but to partly erase from memory after the fact. By the time the pale wasting was no longer dismissed as a series of isolated frontier failures, the Imperium had already committed multiple layers of response across the northeastern marches. The initial actors were not specialized forces, but the standing structures of Imperial presence in the Ghoul Stars and its bordering systems. Planetary defense forces formed the first line by necessity rather than design. These were not elite formations. They consisted of locally raised soldiers, often equipped with aging las-pattern weaponry, flak armor of uneven quality, and limited armored support vehicles adapted to the terrain of their respective worlds. Their role was to maintain order, repel minor incursions, and support tithe security. Against a threat that did not conform to recognizable doctrine, their effectiveness was immediately strained. Naval patrol groups assigned to the region became the second layer. These fleets were responsible for maintaining void lane security, escorting convoys, and responding to distress signals. In the early phase, they operated under incomplete intelligence. Reports they received described both biological degradation and large-scale mechanical constructs, but rarely in the same message. This inconsistency created hesitation in engagement protocols. A fleet prepared to quarantine a plague world was not optimally configured to engage unknown war machines. Conversely, a fleet expecting xenos constructs would not prioritize Medici containment or atmospheric isolation. This mismatch between expectation and reality defined the earliest encounters. As the pattern of destruction clarified, elements of the Astra Militarum were deployed into affected zones. These regiments varied in origin and specialization, but most shared the limitations of operating far from stable supply chains. Ammunition, replacement parts, and medical provisions were inconsistent. Command structures had to adapt quickly to reports that lacked clear enemy profiles. In conventional campaigns, Imperial Guard forces rely on massed firepower, artillery coordination, and predictable engagement ranges. During the Pale Wasting, units reported targets that did not behave according to known biological or mechanical norms. Some engagements described entities or constructs that advanced without regard for suppression fire. Others detailed zones where personnel deteriorated without visible attackers. This blurred the line between battlefield and contamination zone. The Adeptus Mechanicus entered the conflict not as a unified expedition, but through scattered explorator fleets and attached technical cohorts embedded within Imperial operations. Their interest was twofold. First, they sought to identify the technological aspect implied by references to nightmare engines. Second, they aimed to determine whether the phenomenon represented a lost or forbidden technology that could threaten the wider Imperium. Mechanicus personnel brought with them advanced sensor arrays, data collection servitors, and analysis units capable of processing environmental and mechanical anomalies. Their early findings, where preserved, were inconclusive. Readings taken from affected worlds often conflicted with one another. Energy signatures fluctuated beyond expected tolerances. Mechanical traces could not always be matched to known xenos or human designs. In several instances, Mechanicus observers reported that devices or structures appeared to operate without a clear power source or exhibited behaviour inconsistent with established machine logic. The Adeptus Astartes did not appear in the earliest recorded encounters, but once the scale of the crisis became undeniable, their deployment marked a transition from containment to eradication. The presence of multiple chapters indicates that the threat was assessed as severe enough to warrant rapid escalation. The Novamarines, later recognised for their role, were among those committed. Their operational profile emphasised disciplined assault, coordinated strikes, and adherence to codified doctrine. In the context of the Pale Wasting, even such structured approaches were tested by the nature of the enemy. Engagements required adaptation to environments where conventional tactical assumptions failed. Alongside these formal Imperial forces were the less visible but equally significant observers. The Inquisition maintained interest from the early stages, although their direct involvement is more clearly documented later. Rogue traders operating along the fringe may have encountered the phenomenon before official recognition, though such accounts remain inconsistent and often unverified. Civilian populations, while not a faction in the military sense, formed a critical component of the event's early phase. Their experiences provided the first evidence of the Pale Wasting's effects, even if those experiences were poorly recorded or later suppressed. The first encounters did not follow the structure of a declared war. They emerged as investigations, rescues, and quarantine attempts that escalated into combat without clear transition points. A naval vessel responding to a silent colony might enter orbit expecting to restore communication, only to find infrastructure intact but devoid of life. Landing parties reported environments where the physical layout of settlements remained undisturbed, yet biological presence was reduced to remnants or entirely absent. In other cases, survivors exhibited signs of severe degradation, both physical and cognitive, without identifiable pathogens. Medici teams attempting to diagnose these conditions often failed to isolate a cause. This absence of clear etiology hindered containment measures. Hostile encounters became more defined when references to the nightmare engines began to align across separate reports. These constructs, described in varying terms, were large, mobile, and evidently capable of direct destruction. Their design did not conform to known Imperial or widely catalogued xenos engineering. Some accounts describe them as towering structures with articulated segments, moving with deliberate precision across terrain. Others reported more compact forms, but with similar disregard for environmental obstacles. Their presence transformed ambiguous crisis zones into active battlefields. The first confirmed engagements between Imperial forces and these entities revealed several consistent characteristics. The constructs demonstrated resilience against standard weaponry. Las fire and conventional projectile rounds produced limited visible damage. Heavier ordnance achieved more measurable effects but required sustained application. More concerning was the apparent indifference of these entities to losses or environmental hazards. They did not retreat, regroup, or display adaptive maneuvering in ways consistent with known combat doctrines. Instead, they advanced with a singular purpose, often ignoring flanking attempts or suppressive barrages. Simultaneously, the biological aspect of the Pale Wasting continued to manifest. Units operating in proximity to affected zones reported gradual decline among personnel. Symptoms varied, but included loss of physical strength, deterioration of tissue, and reduced cognitive function. In some cases, entire squads became ineffective without direct engagement. This dual pressure forced commanders to divide attention between external threats and internal degradation. Quarantine protocols were implemented, but their effectiveness was inconsistent. The mechanism of spread remained unclear, complicating efforts to isolate affected individuals or areas. Environmental conditions on afflicted worlds further intensified the difficulty of engagement. Atmospheric composition in some zones deviated from baseline readings, though not always to levels immediately lethal. Surface conditions often included widespread structural decay, suggesting prolonged exposure to the underlying phenomenon. In certain regions, flora and fauna exhibited abnormal states, either entirely absent or altered in ways that defied standard biological classification. These factors created battlefields that were as hazardous as the enemy itself. The Astra Militarum's first large-scale engagements highlighted the limitations of conventional tactics. Massed infantry formations, effective against known adversaries, suffered heavy losses when confronted with entities that did not respond predictably to suppression. Artillery proved more reliable, but required precise targeting data that was difficult to obtain in unstable environments. Armoured units provided increased survivability, yet even these assets were not immune to the broader effects of the pale wasting. Reports indicate instances where vehicle crews became incapacitated without direct damage to their machines. Naval forces encountered their own challenges. Void engagements with the constructs, if they extended into space, are sparsely documented. However, fleets attempting orbital bombardment of affected worlds faced uncertainties regarding target identification. Striking population centres risked destroying survivors along with the threat. Conversely, delaying bombardment allowed the phenomenon to continue spreading. Commanders were forced to make decisions with incomplete data, balancing immediate tactical gains against long-term strategic consequences. Astartes forces adapted more effectively, though not without cost. Their enhanced physiology and discipline training provided resistance to some aspects of the affliction, allowing them to operate in zones that proved lethal to standard human troops. Their engagements with the Nightmare engines relied on concentrated firepower, close quarters assault, and coordinated strike patterns designed to exploit structural vulnerabilities. Even so, the lack of consistent intelligence meant that each encounter required rapid assessment and improvisation. The progression from first encounters to sustained hostile engagements was not linear. In many cases, the two phases overlapped. A reconnaissance mission could become a combat operation within moments. A quarantine effort could collapse into open warfare as constructs emerged, or personnel succumbed to the wasting condition. This fluidity prevented the establishment of stable front lines. Instead, the conflict spread in irregular patterns, with isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by zones of complete loss. The involvement of multiple Imperial factions created both advantages and complications. Coordination between the Astra Militarum, naval forces, Mechanicus elements, and Astartes. Chapters required effective communication across vast distances. Astropathic transmission, already unreliable in the region, was further strained by the conditions associated with the pale wasting. Delays and distortions in messaging led to misaligned operations. Units sometimes arrived at objectives that had already been lost, or engaged threats that had shifted location or form. Despite these challenges, the Imperium began to establish a clearer understanding of the threat through cumulative experience. Patterns emerged in the behaviour of the constructs and the progression of the affliction. These insights, however limited, informed subsequent engagements. Commanders adjusted deployment strategies, emphasizing flexibility and redundancy. Mechanicus analysis, while not providing definitive answers, contributed to identifying potential weaknesses in the construct's structure or operation. The cost of these early hostile encounters was significant. Casualty rates among Imperial forces were high, particularly among units deployed without prior exposure to the phenomenon. Equipment losses compounded the strain on supply lines. Entire worlds were effectively removed from Imperial control, either through complete depopulation or conditions rendering them uninhabitable. The scale of loss reinforced the perception that the pale wasting was not a localized crisis, but a systemic threat capable of undermining the Imperium's presence across an entire region. By the end of this phase, the nature of the conflict had shifted decisively. What began as a series of investigations into unexplained frontier failures had evolved into a recognized war against an undefined but highly destructive force. The Imperium's response escalated accordingly, setting the stage for the broader campaign that would follow. The factions involved had moved beyond initial contact and into sustained engagement, with strategies shaped by hard-won experience rather than theoretical doctrine. The pale wasting had revealed itself not as a single enemy, but as a convergence of phenomena that demanded a comprehensive and costly response. By the time the Imperium committed its full strength to the northeastern marches, The Pale Wasting had already consumed a span of territory that could not be restored through conventional means. Entire systems had fallen silent. Trade routes that once connected marginal colonies to the wider Imperium no longer functioned. The pattern of loss had reached a point where containment was no longer viable as a primary objective. The strategic posture shifted toward eradication, even in the absence of complete understanding. The forces deployed into the region were no longer tasked with investigation or stabilization. They were tasked with ending the phenomenon at any cost. The closing phase of the Pale Wasting did not occur as a single decisive battle, but as a prolonged series of engagements across multiple worlds and void corridors. Imperial forces advanced into zones that had already been rendered unstable, operating in environments where infrastructure had collapsed and natural systems had degraded. The objective was consistent across all fronts. Locate the source or sources of the phenomenon, destroy any associated constructs, and prevent further spread into Imperial space. This directive was clear in intent, but difficult in execution due to the fragmented intelligence available to commanders. Astartes Chapters formed the core of the offensive effort. Their deployment marked the transition from reactive defense to coordinated assault. The presence of multiple chapters suggests that the Imperium recognized the need for sustained pressure across a wide operational area. These forces operated with a degree of autonomy, each chapter adapting its approach based on local conditions and the behavior of the threat. Coordination existed, but the nature of the conflict required flexibility at the unit level. Engagements were often isolated, with limited opportunity for reinforcement or withdrawal. The Astra Militarum continued to provide support, though their role evolved. In earlier phases, they had attempted to hold ground and protect civilian populations. In the closing phase, their function shifted towards securing supply lines, establishing forward operating bases, and supporting Astartes operations with artillery and armoured units. Their presence ensured that the offensive could be sustained over time, despite the logistical challenges of operating in a region where standard infrastructure had been compromised. Naval forces played a critical role in isolating the affected systems. Blockades were established to prevent the spread of the phenomenon beyond its existing boundaries. Orbital bombardment was employed selectively, targeting areas where the presence of the nightmare engines had been confirmed, or where planetary conditions indicated irreversible contamination. These actions were not taken lightly. The destruction of entire surface regions, and in some cases entire worlds, reflects the severity of the threat and the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice territory to prevent wider loss. The Adeptus Mechanicus remained engaged throughout this phase, continuing their efforts to analyze the constructs and environmental conditions associated with the Pale Wasting. Their findings, while still incomplete, contributed to identifying points of vulnerability. Reports indicate that certain structural elements of the nightmare engines could be compromised through concentrated fire or specialized munitions. These insights, though limited, provided a basis for more effective engagement strategies. Mechanicus personnel also worked to maintain and repair Imperial equipment under conditions that placed extraordinary strain on machinery, ensuring that operational capability could be sustained. As the campaign progressed, Imperial forces began to achieve measurable successes. Constructs were destroyed in increasing numbers, zones of active contamination were reduced, the rate of new system failures decreased, indicating that the spread of the phenomenon had been slowed, if not entirely halted. These developments suggest that the Imperium was able to identify and target key components of the threat, even without fully understanding its origin or nature. The cost of these successes was significant. The loss of 11 Adeptus Astartes Chapters stands as the most striking indicator of the campaign's severity. Such losses are rare and represent a substantial reduction in the Imperium's elite military capability. The circumstances of these losses are not fully documented, but their scale implies prolonged engagement under conditions that negated many of the advantages typically held by Astartes forces. The survival and subsequent recognition of the Novamarines highlight both their effectiveness and the exceptional nature of the conflict. Their actions were deemed worthy of commemoration, Yet the absence of detailed records within their own archives suggests that even their experiences were subject to restriction or erasure. Civilian populations in the affected regions suffered extensive losses. Many worlds were left depopulated or reduced to levels that rendered them non-viable as Imperial holdings. Others were subjected to quarantine measures that effectively isolated them from the wider Imperium. The long-term impact on these populations is difficult to quantify, but the immediate result was a significant contraction of Imperial presence in the Ghoul Stars and surrounding sectors. This contraction was not temporary. In many cases, the affected systems were abandoned or left under minimal observation, deemed too hazardous for resettlement. The closing of the Pale Wasting is best understood not as a complete resolution, but as a containment of its outward effects. Imperial forces succeeded in halting the expansion of the phenomenon and in destroying the visible manifestations associated with it. However, the underlying cause was not definitively identified or eliminated. This distinction is critical. A war that ends with the destruction of an enemy force provides closure through understanding. A war that ends with the suppression of symptoms leaves open the possibility of recurrence. Following the conclusion of major operations, the Imperium implemented measures to monitor the region and prevent future emergence of similar threats. Astartes Chapters, including the Death Spectres, were assigned to maintain a watch over the Ghoul Stars. Their role was not to govern or expand, but to observe and respond to any indication that the conditions associated with the Pale Wasting were reappearing. This long-term vigilance reflects an institutional recognition that the threat was not fully resolved, but merely contained within acceptable limits. The overall result of the Pale Wasting can be summarized through its impact on Imperial strategy and perception. It demonstrated that the Imperium could face threats that did not conform to established categories of warfare. It exposed the limitations of conventional response structures when confronted with phenomena that combined biological, environmental, and mechanical elements. It forced the Imperium to commit significant resources to a region previously considered marginal, altering the strategic value assigned to the Ghoul Stars. From a military perspective, the campaign reinforced the importance of adaptability. Forces that relied solely on established doctrine suffered higher losses than those capable of adjusting to the unpredictable nature of the threat. The integration of different Imperial factions, while imperfect, proved necessary to address the multifaceted challenges presented by the Pale Wasting. Coordination between Astartes, Astra Militarum, naval forces, and Mechanicus elements allowed for a more comprehensive response, even if communication limitations reduced its efficiency. From an administrative perspective, the event highlighted the risks associated with delayed recognition of emerging threats. The initial stages of the Pale Wasting were characterized by uncertainty and fragmented reporting. By the time the Imperium responded at full scale, the phenomenon had already achieved significant expansion. This delay increased the cost of containment and contributed to the scale of losses incurred. In response, the Imperium's approach to frontier monitoring likely became more cautious, with greater emphasis on identifying patterns of failure before they escalated into systemic crises. From a technological perspective, the encounter with the Nightmare engines raised concerns about unknown or poorly understood forms of machinery. The inability to classify these constructs within existing frameworks suggests that the Imperium's knowledge of potential adversaries remained incomplete. The Mechanicus, while gaining some insights, did not produce a definitive explanation. This gap in understanding remains a point of vulnerability, as it indicates that similar technologies could exist beyond the Imperium's capacity to anticipate or counter effectively. The key findings of the Pale Wasting are therefore not limited to the identification of a single enemy or cause. Instead, they form a set of conclusions about the nature of the threat and the Imperium's response to it. The phenomenon originated from the Ghoul Stars and spread across multiple systems, combining elements of widespread degradation and direct mechanized assault. It resisted conventional classification, complicating both diagnosis and engagement. It required the mobilization of multiple Imperial factions and resulted in substantial losses, including the destruction of 11 Adeptus Astartes Chapters. It was ultimately contained through sustained offensive operations but not fully understood or eradicated. Equally significant is the treatment of the event within Imperial records. The deliberate suppression and censorship of information related to the Pale Wasting indicate that its implications were considered too dangerous or destabilizing for broad dissemination. This decision affects how the event is remembered and studied. Without complete records, future analysis is constrained, relying on fragments and indirect references. This limitation may protect the Imperium from certain forms of panic or exploitation, but it also reduces the ability to prepare for similar threats. In conclusion, the Pale Wasting represents a conflict defined as much by uncertainty as by destruction. Its closing phase achieved the immediate objective of halting its spread and eliminating its visible manifestations. However, the absence of a clear origin or mechanism leaves open questions that continue to influence Imperial policy and vigilance. The event stands as a case study in the challenges of confronting threats that do not align with established models, emphasizing the need for adaptability, coordination, and sustained observation in regions where the boundaries of knowledge remain incomplete. In the aftermath of the Pale Wasting, the surviving administrative and technical bodies of the Imperium were tasked with assembling a coherent understanding from what remained. This process did not begin with clarity. It began with contradiction, data loss, and fragmented testimony. The Adeptus Administratum approached the event as a failure of structure. The Adeptus Mechanicus approached it as a failure of comprehension. Between them, a pattern began to emerge, not as a complete explanation, but as a series of consistent impressions and strategic observations that would influence Imperial policy in the Ghoul Stars for millennia to follow. Administratum records that survived initial censure suggest that the first major impression was scale without proportional signal. In most recorded crises, escalation is preceded by a measurable increase in communication traffic. Distress calls multiply, resource requests spike, and local authorities begin issuing overlapping alerts. During the Pale Wasting, this pattern was partially absent. Entire systems failed with minimal preceding signal. Where communication existed, it often degraded rapidly or became incoherent. This led to a key administrative conclusion. The Imperium had encountered a phenomenon capable of disrupting not only populations, but the informational infrastructure required to detect its spread. From a strategic standpoint, this observation had immediate consequences. The Administratum began to classify the Ghoul Stars as a region where absence of data could no longer be interpreted as absence of threat. This represented a shift in doctrine. Traditionally, resources were allocated based on confirmed need. After the Pale Wasting, the absence of confirmation in certain frontier zones was treated as a potential indicator of extreme risk. This adjustment, while logical, introduced inefficiencies. Resources had to be distributed across a wider range of uncertain targets, increasing strain on already limited supply networks. The Mechanicus contributed a parallel set of impressions, focused on the nature of the anomaly itself. Their surviving logs indicate persistent difficulty in reconciling environmental readings with observed outcomes. In several documented cases, worlds exhibiting severe population loss did not present atmospheric or radiological conditions sufficient to explain such decline. Conversely, areas with measurable environmental deviation did not always correspond to the highest casualty zones. This inconsistency led to the working hypothesis that the Pale Wasting operated through mechanisms not fully detectable by standard sensor arrays. Further analysis suggested that the phenomenon may have interacted with biological systems in a manner that bypassed conventional markers. It is believed by some Mechanicus adepts that the affliction did not rely on known forms of transmission, such as airborne particles, fluid exchange, or direct contact. Instead, it may have involved a more complex interaction between environment, organism, and unknown external factors. This remains unconfirmed, but the absence of identifiable vectors in multiple case studies supports the hypothesis that the Pale Wasting cannot be categorized as a standard biological contagion. The nightmare engines presented an additional layer of complexity. Mechanicus observers noted that their construction did not align with established patterns of either Imperial or commonly encountered xenos technology. Materials recovered from destroyed constructs, where recovery was possible, exhibited properties that resisted classification. Some samples demonstrated structural integrity beyond expected tolerances without corresponding increases in mass. Others appeared to lack internal mechanisms consistent with their observed functionality. This led to speculation that the engines operated on principles not yet understood, or possibly derived from lost technological frameworks. Strategically, the presence of these constructs forced a re-evaluation of threat categorization. The Pale Wasting could not be treated solely as a plague, nor solely as a mechanized invasion. It occupied a position between these categories, requiring a hybrid response. Administratum planning models, which typically relied on defined threat types, proved inadequate. In response, new contingency frameworks were proposed, emphasizing flexibility and rapid adaptation over rigid classification. These frameworks, while more effective in theory, required a level of coordination that was difficult to achieve in practice, particularly in regions with compromised communication. Logistical data gathered during and after the conflict highlights the strain placed on Imperial supply systems. The Ghoul Stars region lacked the infrastructure necessary to support sustained large-scale operations. Supply lines extended over vast distances, passing through unstable or partially charted routes. Convoys were subject to delay, loss, or redirection as conditions changed. Fuel, munitions, and medical supplies were frequently in short supply, forcing commanders to prioritize certain operations over others. One notable observation from administratum records is the rate of material attrition. Equipment deployed into affected zones experienced accelerated degradation. Vehicles required more frequent maintenance. Weapon systems showed increased failure rates. Even standard issue armor exhibited signs of wear beyond expected parameters. While some of this can be attributed to the harsh environmental conditions of the Ghoul Stars, the consistency of these reports suggests that the Pale Wasting may have had indirect effects on machinery, as well as biological systems. The Mechanicus attempted to address these issues through field modifications and adaptive maintenance protocols. Servitor units were reconfigured to operate in high-risk zones with minimal human oversight. Replacement parts were fabricated using available materials, often resulting in non-standard configurations. These measures allowed operations to continue, but introduced variability in equipment performance. Over time, this variability became a factor in strategic planning, as commanders could no longer assume uniform capability across their forces. Another key logistical finding was the difficulty of establishing secure forward positions. Traditional fortification methods relied on stable terrain and predictable threat vectors. In the Pale Wasting, neither condition could be guaranteed. Bases constructed in seemingly secure locations could become compromised without warning. Personnel stationed in these positions reported both external attacks by constructs and internal decline associated with the wasting condition. This dual threat forced a shift toward more mobile operational structures, reducing reliance on fixed installations. Administratum analysts also noted the impact on manpower. Casualty rates were not limited to combat losses. Non-combat attrition, resulting from the wasting condition and associated factors, significantly reduced effective force strength. Replacement personnel were difficult to deploy due to the same logistical constraints affecting material supply. This created a cycle in which units became progressively less capable over time, even without direct engagement. To mitigate this, rotations were attempted, but the unpredictable nature of the threat made it difficult to determine when and where such rotations could be safely executed. From a broader strategic perspective, the Pale Wasting demonstrated the vulnerability of frontier regions to unconventional threats. The Ghoul Stars, already considered a marginal zone, became a focal point for reassessment. Administratum projections began to account for the possibility that similar phenomena could emerge in other poorly understood regions. This led to increased monitoring and, in some cases, preemptive militarization of adjacent sectors. These measures were intended to reduce response time in the event of future incidents. The Mechanicus, for their part, expanded their efforts to catalogue and study anomalous technologies. The inability to fully understand the nightmare engines was seen as a significant gap in Imperial knowledge. Explorator missions were redirected toward identifying potential sources of similar technology, both within and beyond the Ghoul Stars. It is believed that some of these missions yielded additional data, though much of it remains classified or inaccessible. One of the more controversial findings, noted in restricted administratum commentary, was the potential link between the pale wasting and previously unrecorded xenos activity. While no definitive species or origin was identified, the combination of biological and mechanical elements suggested an intelligence or process capable of integrating multiple domains of effect. This possibility raised concerns about the existence of adversaries beyond the scope of known classifications. However, due to the lack of concrete evidence, such conclusions were not formally adopted and remained speculative. The cumulative observations of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus do not provide a complete explanation of the pale wasting. Instead, they establish a framework of understanding based on what could be measured, recorded, and inferred. The event was characterized by rapid system-level failure with limited warning, inconsistent environmental and biological indicators, the presence of advanced and unclassified constructs, and significant strain on logistical and operational structures. These findings influenced subsequent Imperial policy in several ways. Resource allocation models were adjusted to account for uncertainty in frontier regions. Monitoring systems were enhanced, though not always successfully, to detect early signs of similar phenomena. Military doctrine incorporated greater emphasis on adaptability and cross-faction coordination. Technological research prioritized the identification and analysis of anomalous systems, even when such efforts yielded limited immediate results. Despite these adaptations, the pale wasting remained an outlier within Imperial experience. Its combination of characteristics did not fit neatly into existing categories, and the lessons drawn from it were necessarily incomplete. The Administratum and Mechanicus, operating within their respective domains, provided valuable insights, but neither was able to fully resolve the fundamental question of origin and mechanism. In the absence of definitive answers, the Imperium adopted a posture of cautious vigilance. The Ghoul Stars were not reclaimed in full, nor were they abandoned entirely. Instead, they were monitored, studied, and approached with a level of caution not typically applied to other regions. This approach reflects an implicit acknowledgement that the pale wasting was not merely a historical event, but a potential precedent for future occurrences. The impressions, strategic findings, and logistical data gathered by these institutions therefore serve a dual purpose. They document the Imperium's response to a specific crisis, and they provide a reference point for dealing with threats that defy conventional understanding. While incomplete, this body of knowledge represents the most coherent attempt to interpret an event that was, by its nature, resistant to clear definition. The preserved battle records associated with the pale wasting do not present a continuous campaign narrative. Instead, they exist as isolated engagements, partial logs, and reconstructed accounts derived from overlapping administratum tallies and Mechanicus data captures. These records, while incomplete, provide enough consistency to outline several notable engagements and to define the fighting style that emerged across the conflict. The defining characteristic of these battles is not a single decisive confrontation, but repeated contact with an adversary that resisted categorization and forced Imperial forces to abandon conventional expectations. One of the earliest confirmed large-scale engagements occurred on a frontier hive world, positioned along a minor trade artery leading into the Ghoul Stars. Administratum census data indicates that the planet had maintained stable population levels prior to the event, with industrial output consistent with tithe requirements. The initial signs of disturbance were not military in nature. Production quotas began to fluctuate, followed by irregular workforce reports. Within a short span, entire HAB sectors ceased communication. When planetary authorities deployed security forces to restore order, They encountered zones where population density had collapsed without evidence of mass evacuation. Mechanicus survey teams accompanying the initial response recorded environmental readings within acceptable tolerances, yet visual confirmation showed widespread biological degradation. Infrastructure remained structurally intact. Power grids functioned intermittently. Automated systems continued operation without human oversight. This disconnect between environmental stability and population collapse became a recurring feature in subsequent engagements. It indicated that the pale wasting did not rely on overt environmental destruction as its primary mechanism. The first hostile contact on this world was recorded when large constructs emerged within industrial districts previously marked as inactive. These entities advanced without apparent coordination, yet their movement patterns avoided obstacles and navigated terrain with precision. Astra Militarum units deployed to intercept them reported limited effectiveness of standard-less weaponry. Sustained fire produced localized damage, but did not significantly impair movement. Artillery strikes achieved greater results, particularly when targeting joint structures or central mass points identified through repeated engagement. The fighting style observed during this engagement forced immediate adaptation. Infantry units were reorganized into smaller mobile formations to reduce exposure. Armored elements were positioned to deliver concentrated fire at identified weak points rather than engaging in broad suppression. Mechanicus analysis units operated in close proximity to combat zones, attempting to gather real-time data on structural vulnerabilities. This integration of analysis and combat became a standard practice in later engagements, reflecting the need to adjust tactics based on evolving understanding. A second notable engagement occurred within a void corridor linking several affected systems. Naval records indicate that a convoy escort group encountered unidentified constructs operating beyond planetary atmospheres. These entities did not resemble conventional void craft. Their movement did not align with standard propulsion signatures, and their energy output fluctuated in irregular patterns. Initial attempts at communication failed, and the constructs advanced toward Imperial vessels without deviation. The ensuing battle highlighted the limitations of existing naval doctrine when faced with non-standard targets. Imperial ships relied on targeting systems calibrated for known vessel profiles. The construct's irregular forms and inconsistent energy signatures reduced targeting accuracy. Despite this, concentrated macrocannon fire and lance strikes eventually produced measurable damage. Mechanicus observers noted that the constructs did not exhibit defensive maneuvers typical of intelligent adversaries. They did not evade or retreat, instead maintaining direct approach vectors even under sustained fire. This behavior led to a tactical adjustment. Rather than attempting to outmaneuver the constructs, Imperial commanders focused on maximizing firepower within optimal engagement ranges. Ships were repositioned to create overlapping fields of fire, increasing the probability of sustained impact. This approach proved effective, though it required maintaining close proximity to targets that could inflict significant damage upon contact. Several vessels were lost during these engagements, often due to delayed recognition of the construct's destructive capacity at close range. Ground engagements continued to reflect similar patterns. On multiple worlds, Imperial forces reported that the constructs operated in conjunction with zones of intensified biological degradation. Areas where the wasting condition was most severe often coincided with the presence of these entities. This correlation, while not definitively causal, suggested a functional relationship between the two aspects of the phenomenon. Mechanicus teams attempted to analyze these zones, but data collection was frequently disrupted by the same conditions they sought to study. One particularly detailed account describes a prolonged engagement on a mining world characterized by extensive subterranean infrastructure. The planet's surface facilities had already been compromised, and remaining population elements had retreated below ground. Astra Militarum units deployed into these environments encountered both the effects of the wasting condition and active constructs operating within confined spaces. The terrain limited the use of heavy artillery, forcing reliance on infantry tactics and close-range weaponry. In this environment, the constructs demonstrated adaptability not previously observed. Movement patterns adjusted to the confined space, utilizing vertical and lateral surfaces to navigate tunnels and shafts. Imperial forces responded by implementing layered defensive positions, using choke points to concentrate fire. Flamers and melter weapons proved more effective in these conditions, providing both immediate damage and area denial. Mechanicus data from this engagement contributed to identifying thermal and energy-based vulnerabilities in the construct's composition. The fighting style that emerged from these and similar engagements can be characterized by several key elements. First, flexibility replaced rigid formation. Units were required to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, often without clear command directives due to communication disruption. Second, concentration of force became critical. Dispersed firepower was insufficient against targets that required sustained impact to neutralize. Third, integration of analysis and combat operations became essential. Mechanicus involvement was not limited to post-engagement study, but extended into active battlefield support. Administratum records emphasize the importance of maintaining operational continuity despite high attrition rates. Units were frequently reinforced with personnel unfamiliar with the conditions of the Pale Wasting, requiring rapid acclimatization. Training protocols were adjusted to include briefings on known anomalies and expected deviations from standard engagement patterns. This approach improved survivability, though it did not eliminate the inherent risks associated with the conflict. Another recurring feature in battle records is the absence of conventional command structures on the opposing side. The constructs did not exhibit hierarchical organization or coordinated maneuvering indicative of centralized control. This absence complicated efforts to identify strategic objectives or to disrupt command nodes. Imperial forces could not decapitate leadership or exploit command vulnerabilities. Instead, they were required to engage each construct as an independent threat, increasing the duration and intensity of engagements. Despite these challenges, cumulative experience led to incremental improvements in effectiveness. Patterns in construct behavior were identified, allowing for predictive targeting. Weak points, once isolated, were exploited with increasing efficiency. Mechanicus modifications to weapon systems, including adjustments to energy output and firing patterns, enhanced their impact against the constructs. These adaptations did not provide a decisive advantage, but they contributed to gradual attrition of the opposing force. The psychological impact of these battles is also noted in restricted records. Personnel reported difficulty maintaining morale in the absence of a clearly defined enemy. The dual nature of the threat, combining visible constructs with invisible degradation, created a persistent sense of uncertainty. Commanders addressed this through structured routines and reinforcement of discipline, emphasizing adherence to protocol as a means of maintaining operational stability. In summary, the notable battles of the Pale Wasting, as recorded by the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus, reveal a conflict defined by irregular engagement patterns, adaptive fighting styles, and continuous adjustment to an evolving threat. The absence of conventional enemy behavior required Imperial forces to develop new approaches to both ground and void combat. These engagements, while costly, provided the empirical foundation for the strategies employed in the later stages of the campaign. Additional war records compiled after the primary campaign phase do not introduce a single decisive engagement, but instead reinforce the pattern already established in earlier encounters. The Pale Wasting did not culminate in a final battle with a defined endpoint. Rather, it diminished through sustained attrition across multiple zones until active manifestations became increasingly rare. Administratum tallies describe a tapering curve of engagements. Early reports show rapid escalation in both frequency and scale, while later records indicate fewer but still severe conflicts, often occurring in isolated pockets that had either been overlooked or newly destabilized. One such series of engagements occurred across a chain of agri-worlds situated at the outer edge of the affected region. These planets had initially avoided direct impact, maintaining reduced but stable output during the early stages of the crisis. Administratum projections classified them as secondary risk zones, and as such, they did not receive immediate heavy reinforcement. This assessment proved inaccurate. Within a relatively short period, these worlds began exhibiting the same patterns previously observed elsewhere. Crop yields declined without corresponding environmental changes. Labour forces reported fatigue and loss of coordination. Communication delays increased, followed by intermittent signal loss. When Imperial forces arrived, they encountered a familiar combination of biological degradation and mechanical presence. The constructs identified in this region were fewer in number compared to earlier engagements, but displayed increased resilience. Mechanicus analysis suggested that these later stage entities may have incorporated structural adaptations derived from earlier encounters. It is believed by some that the constructs exhibited a form of iterative development, though this remains unconfirmed due to limited sample recovery. Engagements on these worlds required prolonged application of heavy ordnance, often supported by orbital strikes to weaken targets before ground forces advanced. Another notable set of records details conflict within a partially abandoned forge installation on a marginal world near the Ghoul Stars boundary. This facility had ceased primary operations prior to the Pale Wasting, but retained automated systems and residual energy infrastructure. Mechanicus teams dispatched to reclaim or dismantle the site reported anomalous activity within the installation. Internal systems operated without command input, and structural modifications inconsistent with original design were observed. Hostile contact within the facility revealed constructs integrated into the existing architecture. Unlike previous encounters where entities operated as distinct units, these constructs appeared to merge with the environment, utilizing the forge's infrastructure as both support and extension. This integration complicated engagement efforts. Standard targeting methods proved less effective when hostile elements were embedded within load-bearing structures. Mechanicus forces responded by isolating sections of the facility and employing controlled demolition to separate constructs from the surrounding framework. This approach resulted in significant structural loss, rendering the installation unusable, but successfully neutralized the immediate threat. Void-based engagements in the later stages of the campaign became less frequent, but remained strategically significant. Naval patrols continued to encounter isolated constructs operating along previously affected routes. These encounters often occurred without prior indication, reinforcing the conclusion that the Pale Wasting did not adhere to predictable movement patterns. In several cases, Imperial vessels reported sudden proximity alerts followed by immediate engagement. The construct's behavior remained consistent with earlier observations, advancing without evasion and absorbing damage until structural failure occurred. Administratum records emphasize the importance of maintaining blockade integrity during this phase. Even as the frequency of encounters decreased, the potential for resurgence remained a primary concern. Naval forces were instructed to treat all unidentified contacts within the region as hostile until proven otherwise. This directive, while effective in limiting spread, increased operational strain and contributed to resource depletion over time. The aftermath of these additional engagements is characterized by consolidation rather than expansion. Imperial forces did not attempt to reclaim all affected territories. Instead, they focused on securing key systems and establishing monitoring protocols for adjacent regions. Worlds deemed irrecoverable were either subjected to extermination measures or left in quarantine. This decision reflects a pragmatic assessment of resource allocation. The cost of full reclamation was considered disproportionate to the strategic value of the territory, particularly given the unresolved nature of the threat. Mechanicus' involvement in the aftermath shifted toward long-term study and containment. Data collected during the conflict was analyzed in an attempt to identify underlying principles governing the behavior of the constructs and the wasting condition. While some progress was made in understanding structural vulnerabilities, no definitive explanation for the origin or operation of the phenomenon was established. This lack of resolution influenced subsequent research priorities, with increased emphasis placed on identifying and cataloguing anomalous technologies. Administratum analysis of the aftermath focused on systemic impact. The loss of multiple systems, combined with the destruction of infrastructure and population centres, resulted in a measurable contraction of Imperial presence in the region. Trade routes were permanently altered. Tithe contributions from affected sectors were reduced or eliminated. These changes required adjustments to broader economic planning, redistributing burdens across other regions to compensate for the deficit. Manpower considerations also played a significant role in the aftermath. The loss of 11 Adeptus Astartes Chapters represented a reduction in elite military capacity that could not be rapidly replaced. Astra Militarum losses, while more easily replenished, still imposed a strain on recruitment and training systems. The cumulative effect of these losses necessitated a period of recovery, during which the Imperium's ability to respond to additional large-scale threats may have been limited. One of the more subtle but important consequences of the Pale Wasting was its impact on doctrinal development. Administratum and Mechanicus findings contributed to the evolution of threat assessment models. Greater emphasis was placed on identifying anomalies that did not fit established categories. Response protocols were adjusted to allow for more rapid escalation in cases where initial data was incomplete or contradictory. These changes were not universally implemented, but they represent a shift in how the Imperium approached uncertainty. The conclusion drawn by both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus is consistent in its core elements. The Pale Wasting was a large-scale phenomenon originating from the Ghoul Stars that combined aspects of biological degradation and mechanical assault. It spread across multiple systems with limited warning, resisted conventional classification, and required sustained multi-faction response to contain. The destruction of the constructs and the stabilization of affected regions marked the end of active conflict, but did not provide a complete resolution. It is believed by some within the Mechanicus that the absence of a definitive origin indicates that the Pale Wasting may not have been a singular event, but rather an instance of a broader class of phenomena. This interpretation suggests that similar threats could exist beyond the Imperium's current field of knowledge, emerging under conditions not yet understood. Such views remain speculative, but they influence ongoing research and monitoring efforts. Administratum commentary, while less inclined towards speculation, acknowledges the limitations of the available data. The decision to classify and restrict information related to the Pale Wasting reflects an understanding that incomplete knowledge can be as destabilizing as the threat itself. By controlling the dissemination of information, the Imperium seeks to maintain operational stability, even at the cost of reduced transparency. In conclusion, the additional war records and the subsequent aftermath of the Pale Wasting reinforced the perception of the event as an unresolved anomaly. The Imperium succeeded in halting its expansion and mitigating its immediate effects, but did not achieve a complete understanding of its origin or mechanism. The lessons drawn from the conflict emphasize adaptability, caution, and the need for sustained vigilance in regions where the boundaries of knowledge remain uncertain. Inquisitorial records concerning the Pale Wasting begin not with certainty, but with suspicion. Unlike the Administratum, which sought structure, or the Mechanicus, which sought mechanism, the Inquisition approached the event through the lens of deviation. Their primary concern was not what the Pale Wasting was, but what it represented in relation to known threats. From the earliest surviving observations, the phenomenon was flagged as incompatible with established categories of xenos incursion, warp-based corruption, or conventional biological contagion. This incompatibility alone was sufficient to elevate its priority within inquisitorial oversight. The first impressions recorded by inquisitorial agents emphasize the absence of expected signatures. In events involving warp entities, there are typically detectable disturbances. Psychic resonance increases. Astropathic communication becomes erratic in identifiable patterns. Environmental anomalies often correlate with known manifestations of warp influence. During the Pale Wasting, such indicators were either absent or inconsistent. Some affected systems reported no measurable psychic disturbance prior to collapse. Others exhibited minor fluctuations that did not align with the scale of destruction observed. This inconsistency led to a preliminary conclusion that the phenomenon was not primarily warp-driven, though the possibility of indirect warp interaction was not dismissed. Further observations focused on the behaviour of affected populations. Inquisitorial Medicae reports, where available, describe a progression that did not conform to known disease models. Victims exhibited physical decline without consistent pathological markers. Tissue degradation occurred in patterns that resisted classification. In some cases, individuals remained conscious and responsive despite advanced physical deterioration. In others, cognitive function declined rapidly without corresponding structural damage to neural tissue. These discrepancies suggested that the wasting condition operated through mechanisms not yet understood by Imperial medical science. One of the more unsettling findings noted in restricted inquisitorial logs is the apparent selectivity of the phenomenon. Not all individuals within affected zones were impacted simultaneously or to the same degree. Some populations experienced rapid and total collapse, while others remained functional for extended periods under similar conditions. This uneven distribution could not be fully explained by environmental factors or exposure levels. It is believed by some inquisitors that the phenomenon may have interacted with biological or genetic variables, though no definitive pattern has been established. This possibility, if accurate, introduces implications regarding targeted effect rather than indiscriminate spread. The nightmare engines, as observed by inquisitorial agents, presented a separate set of anomalies. Unlike the Mechanicus, which focused on structural analysis, the Inquisition examined these constructs for signs of intent or origin. Reports consistently note the absence of recognizable design philosophy. The constructs did not display the symbolic markings or functional redundancies typical of known xenos technologies, nor did they exhibit the ritualistic elements often associated with warp-influenced machinery. Their operation appeared purposeful, yet devoid of identifiable cultural or doctrinal context. In several documented encounters, inquisitorial observers noted that the constructs did not prioritize targets in a manner consistent with strategic warfare. They did not focus on command centers, supply depots, or communication hubs unless those locations coincided with their path of movement. This behavior suggested that their objective was not conquest in the traditional sense. Instead, their actions appeared aligned with the propagation or maintenance of the wasting condition. This interpretation remains speculative, but it is supported by the consistent association between the construct's presence and intensified zones of degradation. Unexplainable findings within inquisitorial archives extend beyond the physical and into the perceptual. Certain reports describe discrepancies between recorded data and eyewitness accounts. In some cases, surveillance equipment captured no activity in areas where personnel reported direct encounters. Conversely, data logs indicated structural movement or energy fluctuations in zones where observers reported no visible presence. These inconsistencies raised concerns regarding the reliability of sensory input within affected regions. It is unclear whether these discrepancies were the result of environmental interference, technological limitation, or an inherent aspect of the phenomenon itself. Astropathic anomalies, while not dominant, were noted with increasing frequency as the event progressed. Some transmissions contained fragmented imagery or impressions that did not correspond to known locations or events. These fragments were often dismissed as noise or interference, but their recurrence led to further scrutiny. In a limited number of cases, astropaths reported sensations of absence rather than presence, describing communication attempts that seemed to encounter voids where structured thought should have been. Such reports are difficult to quantify, but they contributed to the perception that the pale wasting affected not only physical systems, but also the informational and psychic frameworks through which the Imperium interprets reality. Inquisitorial agents also documented instances of temporal irregularity, though these accounts remain highly contested. Some reports describe discrepancies between subjective experience and recorded time intervals. Personnel operating within affected zones occasionally reported extended durations of activity that did not align with external timekeeping systems. These observations were not consistent across all engagements and may be attributable to environmental stress or equipment malfunction. However, their presence in multiple independent accounts prevents outright dismissal. If accurate, they suggest that the pale wasting may have influenced temporal perception or measurement, further complicating analysis. Another area of concern was the apparent resilience of the phenomenon to standard containment measures. Quarantine protocols, effective against known biological threats, yielded inconsistent results. Isolation of affected populations did not always prevent further spread. In some cases, previously unaffected zones developed symptoms despite strict containment. This failure undermined confidence in established response procedures and prompted consideration of alternative containment strategies, including more extreme measures. The Inquisition's interpretation of these findings was cautious but direct. The pale wasting was classified as an anomaly that did not conform to existing threat categories and therefore required ongoing observation and restricted dissemination of information. The lack of a definitive origin or mechanism was itself considered a risk factor. Without clear understanding, the potential for recurrence could not be accurately assessed or mitigated. It is believed by some within the Inquisition that the phenomenon may represent an interaction between multiple unknown variables rather than a single identifiable cause. This perspective suggests that the pale wasting could be the result of converging conditions unique to the Ghoul Stars region, possibly involving ancient technologies, unknown xenos influences, or environmental factors not yet recognized. Such interpretations remain speculative and are not universally accepted, but they reflect the difficulty of assigning the event to a singular explanatory model. In summary, the Inquisition's impressions and observations of the pale wasting emphasize its deviation from known patterns, its resistance to classification, and the presence of multiple unexplainable findings across biological, mechanical, and perceptual domains. These characteristics inform the decision to restrict information and to maintain long-term surveillance of the affected region. The phenomenon was not dismissed as an isolated incident, but recognized as a potential indicator of broader unknowns within the galaxy. Inquisitorial documentation of direct encounters during the pale wasting is fragmented by design. What remains accessible exists in redacted form, reconstructed through cross-referencing sealed fragments, witness interrogations, and restricted field logs. Unlike administratum summaries or Mechanicus analyses, these records focus less on operational clarity and more on anomalies observed during direct contact. The encounters preserved in these archives are not presented as typical battle reports. They are recorded as incidents, deviations, and failures of expected reality under controlled observation. One such documented encounter originates from an inquisitorial investigation team deployed to a partially evacuated hive settlement on the edge of the affected region. The initial objective was verification of quarantine integrity. Upon arrival, the team reported structural normality across the upper habitation tiers. Atmospheric readings fell within habitable parameters. No immediate hostile presence was detected. However, population density readings conflicted with visual observation. Auspex systems indicated biological signatures within sealed habitation blocks that appeared empty upon inspection. Further investigation revealed that these discrepancies were not equipment malfunction. Personnel entering these zones reported the sensation of being observed despite the absence of visible inhabitants. Audio logs captured intermittent sound patterns resembling movement or vocalization, but without consistent source localization. Attempts to triangulate these signals produced contradictory results. In some cases, the source appeared to shift position without traversing intervening space. These findings were recorded as perceptual anomalies rather than confirmed hostile activity. The situation escalated when members of the investigation team began exhibiting early signs consistent with the wasting condition, despite minimal exposure time. Standard decontamination procedures were initiated, but progression continued in isolated cases. Notably, affected individuals reported no physical discomfort during initial stages, only a gradual loss of strength and coordination. Medical scans failed to identify pathogens or structural damage correlating with observed symptoms. This encounter reinforced the conclusion that the wasting condition could manifest independently of direct contact with known vectors. Another sealed report details an engagement within a void station that had ceased communication during the mid-phase of the conflict. Inquisitorial forces boarded the station under the assumption of mechanical failure or hostile takeover. Internal systems were operational, though inconsistently. Lighting fluctuated without corresponding power instability. Environmental controls maintained habitable conditions. Despite this, the station was devoid of active crew. As the investigation progressed, the team encountered localized structural alterations. Sections of the station exhibited configurations not present in original schematics. Corridors extended beyond recorded dimensions. Compartments appeared to connect in non-linear arrangements. These alterations were not uniform but occurred in isolated segments, creating zones where spatial continuity could not be reliably mapped. Attempts to chart these areas resulted in inconsistent data, with recorded paths failing to correspond to physical traversal. Hostile contact occurred when constructs emerged within these altered sections. Unlike previous encounters, these entities appeared partially integrated into the station structure, similar to reports from Mechanicus observations on forge installations. Engagement was complicated by the instability of the environment. Lines of sight shifted unpredictably. Weapon discharge produced expected effects on targets, but secondary impacts on surrounding structures did not always align with observed damage patterns. This led to difficulties in assessing both threat level and collateral risk. During this encounter, one of the more significant anomalies was recorded. A member of the inquisitorial team reported visual confirmation of a construct occupying a corridor segment. Simultaneously, another observer, positioned within the same line of sight, reported no such presence. Auspex readings fluctuated between confirming and denying the existence of the entity. Engagement proceeded based on partial confirmation, resulting in damage to the target. Post-engagement analysis indicated structural disruption consistent with the presence of a construct, though direct visual confirmation remained inconsistent across all observers. Astropathic anomalies documented during the Pale Wasting are among the most restricted elements within inquisitorial archives. Surviving reports describe transmission attempts that yielded incomplete or distorted returns. In several instances, astropaths reported encountering what they described as absences within the communication medium. These were not voids in the conventional sense, but regions where expected psychic resonance failed to manifest. Attempts to navigate or interpret these absences resulted in cognitive strain, often accompanied by loss of coherent thought. One sealed account describes an astropathic choir attempting to relay a distress signal from an affected system. The transmission initiated successfully, but fragmented midway through execution. Members of the choir reported simultaneous perception of multiple conflicting impressions. Some described vast emptiness, others reported structured forms without identifiable features. The transmission terminated abruptly, and subsequent attempts to re-establish contact failed. Post-incident evaluation determined no permanent damage to the choir, but several members required extended recovery due to mental fatigue. Temporal discrepancies, while not consistently observed, appear in multiple encounter logs. In one instance, an inquisitorial detachment operating within a contaminated zone recorded a mission duration of approximately 3 standard hours. External monitoring systems, however, indicated that the team had been active for nearly twice that period. Equipment logs confirmed the extended duration, while subjective reports from personnel aligned with the shorter timeframe. This inconsistency was not resolved and remains classified as an unexplained anomaly. Sealed reports also include references to entities or phenomena that do not align with the previously described constructs or wasting condition. These references are sparse and often heavily redacted, but they suggest the presence of additional variables within the Pale Wasting. It is believed by some that these may represent misinterpretations of existing elements under extreme conditions. Others consider the possibility that multiple distinct phenomena were present simultaneously, interacting in ways that produced the observed effects. These interpretations remain speculative and are not supported by sufficient evidence to be considered definitive. One of the more controversial aspects of inquisitorial documentation is the treatment of witness testimony. Individuals who survived direct encounters were subjected to extensive interrogation and, in many cases, memory alteration or erasure. This practice reflects the perceived risk associated with uncontrolled dissemination of information. Testimonies that could not be reconciled with established understanding were often classified and restricted, rather than integrated into broader analysis. As a result, the available record may exclude data deemed unreliable or destabilizing. The decision to seal and restrict these reports was not uniform across all inquisitorial branches. Variations in interpretation and policy led to differences in how information was handled. Some agents advocated for broader analysis, arguing that understanding required access to all available data regardless of inconsistency. Others prioritized containment, emphasizing the risks posed by incomplete or contradictory information. The resulting archive is therefore both a record of the event and a reflection of internal inquisitorial divergence. In summary, the documented encounters and recorded anomalies within inquisitorial archives present a view of the pale wasting that extends beyond conventional warfare. The phenomenon is characterized not only by physical destruction and biological degradation, but also by inconsistencies in perception, measurement, and interpretation. Sealed reports preserve these anomalies, though often in incomplete form, reflecting both the limitations of observation and the deliberate restriction of information. These records do not provide definitive answers. Instead, they highlight the extent to which the pale wasting challenged the Imperium's ability to observe and understand. The anomalies recorded during direct encounters suggest that the phenomenon operated across multiple domains, affecting not only physical systems, but also the frameworks through which those systems are perceived and analysed. This complexity reinforces the Inquisition's conclusion that the pale wasting cannot be fully explained within existing models, and that continued vigilance is required in regions where similar conditions may arise. The highest classification tiers within inquisitorial archives do not attempt to complete the record of the pale wasting. Instead, they impose limits on how it may be interpreted. The surviving files at this level are not chronological narratives, but controlled summaries, sealed annotations, and directive statements intended to shape future response, rather than preserve past clarity. Where earlier records contain contradiction, these documents enforce boundaries. They define what must not be assumed, what cannot be disseminated, and what remains unresolved. One of the central determinations recorded in these classified files is that the pale wasting does not meet the criteria for singular attribution. It is not formally assigned to any known xenos species, nor is it confirmed as a warp origin event. It is not categorized as a conventional contagion, nor as a purely mechanized incursion. The refusal to assign classification is not presented as indecision, but as a precaution. The Inquisition recognizes that premature categorization creates false confidence, and false confidence reduces survival probability in future encounters. This position establishes the pale wasting as a standing anomaly, rather than a concluded case. A second directive concerns informational containment. The suppression of records is not limited to sensitive details, but extends to structural understanding of the event itself. Certain correlations observed during the conflict are deliberately omitted from accessible archives. These include patterns linking the progression of the wasting condition to specific environmental or operational variables that remain poorly understood. It is believed that these omissions are intended to prevent misapplication of incomplete data, particularly in regions where similar anomalies might emerge. The Inquisition's approach favors ignorance over misinterpretation when the latter could produce systemic failure. Within restricted commentary, there are references to internal debate regarding the nature of the phenomenon. Some inquisitors argued that the pale wasting represented an early-stage manifestation of a broader threat not yet fully realized. This interpretation suggests that the event was not an isolated occurrence, but a partial exposure to a process or entity whose full capabilities remain unknown. Others rejected this view, maintaining that the absence of recurrence at comparable scale indicates a localized anomaly. These perspectives remain unresolved, and both are preserved within classified discourse without formal endorsement. Further classified material addresses the behavior of the nightmare engines in greater detail. While Mechanicus analysis focused on structure and function, inquisitorial assessment emphasizes pattern. Across multiple engagements, the constructs demonstrated consistency in objective but variability in manifestation. Their actions did not prioritize strategic targets in a manner consistent with territorial conquest. Instead, they appeared to operate in alignment with the spread or reinforcement of the wasting condition. This observation led to the hypothesis that the constructs were not primary agents, but extensions of a larger system. Whether this system is autonomous, directed, or emergent remains undetermined. An additional point of concern within classified files is the interaction between the pale wasting and Imperial detection frameworks. Several reports indicate that standard methods of observation, including visual confirmation, Auspex scanning, and astropathic sensing, produced inconsistent or conflicting results within affected zones. These inconsistencies were not uniform, but occurred with sufficient frequency to undermine confidence in data reliability. The implication is that the phenomenon may have interfered with the processes by which information is gathered and interpreted, rather than merely evading detection. This distinction is significant, as it suggests that future encounters may require alternative methods of verification beyond established systems. There are also references to cases in which individuals exposed to the pale wasting retained partial awareness of their condition without exhibiting corresponding physical symptoms. These cases are rare and heavily redacted, but they are noted for their deviation from the general pattern of decline. In such instances, subjects reported altered perception of their environment, including awareness of structural or spatial inconsistencies not detected by instruments. It is believed by some inquisitors that these individuals may have experienced the phenomenon at a different level of interaction, though the implications of this remain unclear. All known subjects were subjected to containment measures, and no further data is available regarding long-term outcomes. The treatment of temporal anomalies within classified files is similarly cautious. While earlier records acknowledge discrepancies in time perception and measurement, higher-level analysis avoids definitive conclusions. The possibility that the pale wasting affected temporal frameworks is neither confirmed nor dismissed. Instead, it is recorded as an observed irregularity requiring further study. This restraint reflects the Inquisition's broader approach to phenomena that challenge foundational assumptions. Without sufficient evidence, even repeated observation is not elevated to confirmed status. One of the most significant elements within these files is the acknowledgement of residual uncertainty following the conclusion of the campaign. The pale wasting was contained, but not resolved. The constructs were destroyed or rendered inactive, and the spread of the wasting condition was halted. However, no definitive origin point was identified, and no mechanism was isolated that could be targeted in future occurrences. This absence of closure is treated as a permanent condition rather than a temporary gap in knowledge. As a result, the Inquisition established a series of long-term directives regarding the Ghoul Stars and adjacent regions. These directives include continuous monitoring, restricted access, and rapid escalation protocols in response to any anomalous activity. Astartes chapters assigned to the region are expected to operate with a heightened level of autonomy, authorized to act without standard administrative delay when encountering conditions resembling those of the pale wasting. This reflects an institutional decision to prioritize response speed over procedural oversight in environments where delay has previously proven catastrophic. The final assessments within classified files do not attempt to simplify the event. Instead, they reinforce its complexity. The pale wasting is described as a convergence of factors that cannot be fully separated or understood in isolation. Biological degradation, mechanical manifestation, perceptual inconsistency, and informational disruption are all recognized as components of the phenomenon. None are identified as primary. This refusal to assign hierarchy among observed elements underscores the Inquisition's conclusion that the event does not conform to linear causality. In their final thoughts, inquisitorial analysts emphasize the importance of maintaining uncertainty as an operational parameter. The Imperium's strength lies in its ability to apply overwhelming force against defined threats. The Pale Wasting demonstrated that not all threats can be defined within existing frameworks. In such cases, the application of force remains necessary but must be accompanied by recognition of its limitations. Victory in this context is measured not by complete understanding, but by the prevention of further loss. It is believed by some within the Inquisition that the true significance of the Pale Wasting lies not in the damage it caused, but in what it revealed. The galaxy contains phenomena that operate beyond the Imperium's current capacity to observe, classify, or counter with certainty. The Ghoul Stars serve as a persistent reminder of this limitation. The absence of further large-scale incidents does not negate the possibility of recurrence. It indicates only that the conditions required for such an event have not yet aligned again. In conclusion, the classified files present the Pale Wasting as an unresolved anomaly that has been contained through force but not understood through analysis. The Inquisition's response is therefore ongoing rather than complete. Surveillance continues, information remains restricted. Preparedness is maintained without expectation of clarity. The event is not closed within inquisitorial doctrine. It is preserved as a standing uncertainty, a precedent for future encounters with phenomena that resist explanation and demand response regardless.